All right, guys, for the chapter on the counterculture, I am going to upload this video to the classroom for you to watch because we will not be going over it in class. So you can follow along on the Prezi with the link already on the classroom. And if you have any questions, you can send me a remind. So, talking about the counterculture. And the counterculture really is the music, the art of a generation. The biggest groups of the counterculture were the Beatles. Then you have Jimi Hendrix and Joni Mitchell, both of whom actually played at Woodstock and who were succumbed to the drugs that were a huge part of the counterculture as well. And then the next slide is a slide of Jimi Hendrix performing the Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock. And then the culture itself. Again, the culture was really big on music, art, literature. Andy Warhol would be the biggest artist of the time period. Andy Warhol, you guys probably know him for the Campbell soup cans that he drew. He drew pop culture. He drew American culture. He also had a very, very famous painting of Marilyn Monroe, which is on the Prezi, as you can see right there. Andy Warhol's paintings today sell for millions of dollars. When you think of the counterculture, you should think of, besides music, besides art, you really should think of hippies. Hippies are the counterculture. That's the name of the people that were in the counterculture. A lot of these hippies moved to Haight-Ashbury, which is in San Francisco, and they were peace, love, drugs, alcohol. All these things were a part of the hippie movement. They had something called a sexual license, meaning that they did sleep around a lot. That was a part of the hippie culture. They also, it was called free love. They lived in communes, and again, the biggest commune was in Haight-Ashbury. And there we have a picture of a commune. LSD was a big drug that was a part of the culture, as well as marijuana. A lot of the people who are in the hippie movement started to explore Eastern religions like Buddhism. Psychedelic, all the colors, Aquarius, those were some of the signs of the hippie movement. The movement will come to an end when Nixon enters the White House and America starts to become more conservative. This is going to happen in the late 60s. Early 70s, and it's also going to come to an end because a lot of the leaders, the musicians and people of that time, they're actually going to die from a lot of the drugs, the LSD and things that they take. And so with these people dying out, the movement itself will also die out. The next movement that I'm going to discuss is the women's rights movement, and again, we're just going along on the Prezi. So if you are taking notes, because you do need these notes. So if you are taking notes, make sure you are taking all of the notes from the Prezi. All right. Please, 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 ladies and gentlemen, do not get the women's rights movement mixed up. There have been many women's rights movements in American history. The Seneca Falls movement with Lucretia Mott and Miss Stanton, Miss Anthony in the 1900s with the women's rights movement to try to get the right to vote, the suffragist movement. This movement we're talking about, the women's rights movement, it's going to be in the 1960s and the 1970s. It's a wave of feminism that swept across the country during this decade, and it actually starts when Betty Friedan writes a book called The Feminine Mystique. And in this book, she wrote about how women were kind of like many men thought that women should just be at home. They should taking care of the kids. She wrote that women wanted more out of life. That yes, they didn't mind raising a family, but they also wanted more. They wanted careers, and that a lot of women did not feel fulfilled just being housewives. The two main leaders of the women's rights movement was Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, who start now, the National Organization of Women, and now had a few big things that they wanted. The first thing they wanted is that they wanted women to have the equal rights of men. They wanted women to be able to have the same pay as men. They also wanted a equal rights amendment added to the Constitution that would guarantee that women received equal rights as men. They also wanted reproductive rights for women. So they're going to be huge opponents of the court case Roe versus Wade. Again, as the next slide says, their number one goal was to get the ERA passed, the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment actually passed both houses of Congress. It passes the House, it passes the Senate. It goes to the states, because if you guys know anything about the Constitution, which you haven't taken civics yet, so you'll learn a bit more about this next year. But in order for an amendment to be added to the Constitution, 3/4 of the states have to approve the amendment. So the amendment passes both houses of Congress, it goes to the states, and it fails. It fails, I think, by about 1 or 2. I can't remember how many states it did not get. But it actually fails because of a woman, which might not make a lot of sense to you guys. But a woman, her name is Phyllis Schlafly. She's still around. She is an anti-women's rights. She believes that women's rights will actually, if this amendment is passed, then women would actually be treated like men. She believes that it would make women be drafted into the army. She believes that this will make women less women of a woman, excuse me. And so she actually campaigns for this movement to die, this ERA amendment to die, and it actually does. We still do not have an ERA today. Women still receive, as we've discussed in class, women still receive 79 cents to every dollar that men receive. So it's still an ongoing fight. The military, women for the first time can go into combat for the last few years. And I saw in the news 2 days ago that it has been through committee that they are actually thinking about drafting women into the army now. So girls, you might, and when you turn 18, just like boys, in a few years, you might have to sign up for the selective service because they are thinking about drafting women into the military. And the second thing that Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan were trying to get was reproductive rights for women. They want to make abortions legal. For years, women have always gotten abortions. They just did not get abortions where women get abortions now. Women today, they go to clinics, they see doctors who actually know what they're doing. Before Roe versus Wade, which is the court case that made abortions legal in the United States, before Roe versus Wade, women still had abortions. They went to back alley clinics, and a lot of times these doctors would use hangers and other unsterilized equipment. Different food that they said could help induce abortions, and hundreds of women died getting abortions. And so Roe v. Wade said that it was a woman's right, her right of privacy, the Ninth Amendment, that women should be able to have abortions. And different states have different times when abortions are still legal. The next slide is the legacy of the women's rights movement. There are laws on the books that if a woman is discriminated against, she can sue her company. For you girls who play sports, the biggest legacy of the women's rights movement is probably Title IX, which prohibits discrimination in education. This includes sports. And after this amendment, after this piece of this movement, more and more women are going to enter the workplace. Today, most homes who have a two-parent home, most of the women will also work. The next movement we're going to talk about is the Chicano movement and the Latin American movement. It was actually founded by Cesar Chavez. He was he founded the Migrant farm worker movement. He was trying to get equal pay for migrant farm workers. Migrant farm workers are workers, they are usually Latino, who go from state to state or from county to county looking for seasonal work. These people were treated very unfairly. Their wages were very low. They lived in these houses that were not sanitary. And so Cesar Chavez, he wanted them to have good working conditions and pay so that they could actually live. And he actually decides to use the methods of Martin Luther King Jr. The methods of nonviolence to try to get his point across. One of the biggest boycotts that the United Farm Workers used was the grape boycott. It was in California, and they would actually stand outside of grocery stores with picket signs, and they would let people know that the grapes and the other produce that they were buying in these supermarkets were being picked by people who were not getting paid like they should, and who were being treated very, very unequally. The Chicano movement was a bigger movement of the migrant workers. A Chicano is a Mexican born here in the United States, and they really wanted to make sure that especially students, Latino students, knew about their culture and about their history. La Raza Unida was what they called their movement. Like the blacks had the Black Panther movement, the Latinos had the La Raza Unida, which means brown power. And they wanted, not only did they want better education for Latino students in schools, they also wanted better housing and better job opportunities. They're actually going to start different co-ops and different banks so that Latinos could have somewhere where they could go get business loans and things of that nature as well. AIM was a movement for the Native Americans. They wanted autonomy. As we've discussed in this class over the last few weeks, Native Americans always got the short end of the stick. During the late 1800s, we took their land. We put them on reservations. Most of these reservations were land that couldn't be used. You couldn't farm it. And then we found oil on some of these reservations, so we kicked them out of there. And so the Native Americans really wanted their land rights back. They wanted a lot of the land that the government had taken from them, and they had not been duly compensated. So this is going to be the majority of their movement. But unlike the Chicano movement, the African American movement, the AIM movement is actually going to be violent. Again, they wanted civil rights, they wanted land rights, and the biggest thing from the Native American movement, the AIM movement, that we remember is Wounded Knee. So if you guys remember back at the beginning of class, we talked about Wounded Knee, and we remember Sitting Bull, and how the people were killed by the army at Wounded Knee. Well, in 1973, AIM is going to go back to Wounded Knee. There was actually an Indian reservation there, and AIM is going to take over that reservation, that village in Wounded Knee, and they are going to take it violently, and they actually refuse to leave the area until the government listened to their demands. The FBI actually came onto Wounded Knee, and there was a shootout between them and FBI, and 2 people were killed in that shootout at Wounded Knee. You can also note that another thing that the Native Americans did in the AIM movement that was also violent is that they actually took over Alcatraz and for a few days. And Alcatraz is a little island in California. It's where the big prison is. And they took that over, claiming that that was their land and that they needed it. They wanted it back. Other movements, many people, again, after the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Movement is going to trigger, it's going to be the catalyst that starts other movements. Japanese Americans, if you guys remember, during World War II, Japanese Americans were actually interned because the president had them interned, saying that they were a threat to America. And by the 1960s and the 1970s, these people started to fight for